Luke chapter 24 will be our text for this morning. And what a blessing it is to have a special song before the message today. We'll have to get them to do that more often. Definitely, big time. And I know there's a few others who are planning some songs, and that's wonderful. Looking forward to it. The subject of the song is exactly the subject, of course, that we've been thinking about today, as it is Easter, the day in which we celebrate the resurrection of Christ. But I think the statement, the question really that's raised in the song is, what does Christ being alive mean because he lives? What is the result of this fact that he is alive? And to get to that question, we come now to Luke 24. The resurrection of Jesus Christ is without a doubt the most pivotal event in all of human history, without a question. There is no question about it. If Jesus rose from the dead, the meaning of that is absolutely night and day. It's on or off. It's either this is a hugely significant thing, one way or another. Either Jesus did rise from the dead, or Jesus didn't rise from the dead. And if he really, truly rose from the dead, I mean really, not just, a lot of people believe it, and it's a nice story. I'm talking about that. None of that matters. All of that is just a whole bunch of fluff. What I want to ask is, did Jesus actually rise from the dead? Because if he actually rose from the dead, then this entire book is true. It's true because Jesus said so, and Jesus rose from the dead. People don't just rise from the dead. You say, well, I don't believe it because people don't rise from the dead. That's what makes it significant that he rose from the dead, don't you think? Because people don't rise from the dead. Therefore, if Jesus did rise from the dead, then the things that he said must be pretty important. They must be true. Because there must be a God in heaven. Otherwise, how could somebody rise from the dead? And if there's a God in heaven, why would he raise someone who is going around as a fraud and a liar? So if Jesus rose from the dead, everything he said must have been true. And Jesus spoke about the Old Testament and the New Testament of the Bible. He spoke about the Old Testament saying that it was actually the words of God. Meaning that when we open the Bible, if Jesus really rose from the dead, we are actually reading words that were inspired by God. He spoke to the disciples about how they would be bringing further revelation, and that's what we have in the New Testament of the Bible. Jesus confirmed these things. If Jesus really rose from the dead, that means he wasn't a fraud and a liar. That means all of this is true. That means that there is a God in heaven. He really created all things. He really created everything for a purpose. And if we want to know why we exist, the purpose for which we were created, we have to look here. If Jesus really rose from the dead, everything else comes with it. Everything about this book becomes the most important things in our lives. Because we were created by the God who wrote for us his will and his desires and what he wants us to do. If Jesus rose from the dead. But then, if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, this book is completely useless. It's worse than that. It is filled with lies and fraud, and it should be avoided at all cost. If Jesus didn't rise from the dead, then the prophets in the Old Testament who predicted when the Messiah would come, right when Jesus walked the earth, the prophets in the Old Testament who predicted that the Messiah, when he came, would be crucified and rise from the dead, in 1,000 years before crucifixion was invented, David wrote in Psalm 22 that the Messiah was going to have his hands and his feet pierced when he was killed. Isaiah in 53 tells us that the Messiah would be put in a grave, he would die, and then he would be alive again. All of those prophets were wrong. And the entire Bible is one big set of lies if Jesus didn't rise from the dead. His disciples aren't trustworthy because they're either lying or they're fools who believe a lie that Jesus rose from the dead. You see that this is the crucial, critical question. Did Jesus rise from the dead truly? If he did, it means the world, because everything is now bound up in what he tells us in this book. That's why we come here every Sunday to study this book. That's why we say go home and take this book with you and read it and study it and learn it and go out and live it. Or Jesus didn't rise from the dead, and everything we do here in this church is not only useless, but it's deceptive and lies and wrong. You can't have middle ground. You can't say, oh, those churches, those are nice, but I don't believe any of that stuff. If you don't believe it, then we aren't nice. We're the worst people in the world. We're just spreading a bunch of lies about a guy who supposedly rose from the dead, and he didn't. So here's the question. Did Jesus rise from the dead? It sounds a lot like a fairy tale. Somebody rising from the dead? Read with me, if you would, Luke 24. And we'll see that that instinct is the instinct of the apostles. Verse number 1. Now, on the first day of the week, very early in the morning, they came unto the sepulchre, bringing the spices which they had prepared, and certain others with them. And they found the stone rolled away from the sepulchre. And they entered in, and found not the body of the Lord Jesus. And it came to pass, as they were much perplexed thereabout, behold, two men stood by them in shining garments. And as they were afraid, and bowed down their faces to the earth, they said unto them, why seek ye the living among the dead? He is not here, but is risen. Remember how he spake unto you when he was yet in Galilee, saying, the Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men, and be crucified, and the third day rise again. And they remembered his words, and returned from the sepulchre, and told all these things unto the 11, that is, the 11 disciples, and to all the rest. It was Mary Magdalene, and Joanna, and Mary the mother of James, and the other women that were with them, which told these things unto the apostles. And their words seemed to them as idle tales. Idle tales. They believed them not. It sounded to them, that word idle tales just means a foolish story. It just seems like a foolish story. Here's maybe how it might be put if it was written in 2024. It seemed to them like a conspiracy theory. Now, we use the word conspiracy theories for things that don't have anything to do with conspiracies. But, it just seems crazy. You're telling me that you went to the tomb, and the tomb is empty, and Jesus is alive. We all saw him die. We all saw him go to the cross. We ran away, but we all heard that he died. Romans didn't accidentally not kill their crucifixion victims. He's definitely dead, and he was put in the tomb 3 days ago, and you're telling us he's alive. Here's what I think happened, ladies. I think you guys really want to see Jesus again. And you imagined that you saw Jesus. You imagined that you saw angels that told you. This sounds like a conspiracy to me. This sounds like an idle tale, like something that's wishful thinking. It sounds too good to be true, or just too crazy to be true. Good or not, it doesn't sound real. Jesus rose from the dead. And I think this is our instinct. We often think, man, rising from the dead, that just seems out there. And there's two responses to that. Either when we start thinking about how crazy this is, this sounds so crazy, somebody rose from the dead, we either say, well, I just believe it because I believe it. And that's a bad reason to believe anything. That's the reason that Muslims blow themselves up in the name of Allah, because they believe it. Okay? That's not a good reason to believe in Jesus. Now, you just happen to be right, but that doesn't make it a good reason that you're right. That's the reason that Mormons believe in Joseph Smith, who's, by the way, dead. He didn't rise from the dead. He's dead. He was shot in a riot because of his polygamy. There's many people. We could go through the list. All kinds of wrong faiths that are based on just believing something. Do we believe the most important thing in all of history because it just We just believe it. Or the other response is to say, well, it just sounds out there. It must not be true. Well, if it's not true, it certainly deserves you looking into it to prove that it's not true. Don't you think it would be important to at least consider it? Because since this is the most crucial event in all of human history, if it is true, it would certainly behoove us to examine it and see if it is true. It needs to be looked at. It needs to be examined, because if it's true, it makes every difference in all of the world, and not even in this world, in the next. Our eternity is based on it. Heaven or hell rests on this truth. We should at least be sure that it's not true before you just dismiss it, and most people just dismiss it. Either I just believe it or I just don't believe it. Most people have never considered the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And I want to do that this morning. I want to examine the evidence. Do something that the apostles didn't initially do. They didn't examine the evidence. Well, two of them did. When these women came back to the apostles, at least when one of them came back, we studied this morning, how Mary Magdalene was in this group, and she saw the empty tomb and never saw the angels, or at least not at first. She turned around and ran to tell the apostles, the 11 men that Jesus had chosen to be his disciples. And two of them ran to the empty tomb to see if it was true that it was empty. And they examined the evidence and walked away believing. But the rest of the apostles didn't even bother going to look to see if it was true. They didn't care. They thought, "There's no way this is true." They didn't even bother to look. Well, we're not going to be those 9 this morning. We're going to be the 2. We're going to be Peter and John, if you will. Let's examine this. Let me first say that we have reliable historical evidence for many things, including the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Let's start with the fact that Jesus was alive. Some people say, well, the whole Jesus thing was a myth. It was just made up by the Romans, Jesus never really existed. That's so ridiculous. It's laughable. Not even atheist historians would entertain that idea. Jesus really lived, and he really went around doing miracles. You say, how do we know? Because there were a lot of people who hated Christians in the 1st century A.D., when Christians were going around talking about Jesus. And we have a lot of their writings. We have ancient manuscripts from people who hated Christians. And not one of them ever brought up the idea that Jesus didn't exist. Now, that might strike you as odd. Even if you told me that somebody over in China was doing miracles and I should believe him, I think that somebody who doesn't believe him might say, I don't think he exists. But this is not what we have with the Gospels. In the Gospels, we have the actual people who saw Jesus being preached to by the apostles. The apostles are going to the Jewish people in Jerusalem and saying, you guys know Jesus, right? Well, he rose from the dead. And people believed them, which means Jesus had to be a real person who was really going around and doing real things that people thought were miracles, or else nobody would have believed the apostles at all. He has to have actually existed. He definitely existed. We know this from historical evidence. Even the enemies of Christ knew he existed, and they all knew that he was crucified by the Romans. This was a public crucifixion. It was a public trial. And so when the apostles were preaching to the Jews and to the Pharisees who did not want to receive this, never one time did they suggest that Jesus didn't die. That's why you saw him afterwards. He never was crucified. We don't believe he was crucified. Jesus definitely lived, and he definitely was crucified. We know that from historical documentation. We know that from the enemies of Christianity at the time, who admitted Jesus was a real person, who people believed did miracles, and he certainly died. So the question then becomes, did Jesus rise from the dead? Do we have good reason to think that Jesus rose from the dead? Now, some would say no, because it's a rising from the dead. That's not possible. So there's no good reason to ever think that anyone ever rose from the dead. Yeah, if you dismiss the one person who did rise from the dead, then sure, you can say no one ever rises from the dead. But if Jesus did rise from the dead, it would be an example of somebody rising from the dead. So we can't just dismiss it. We must examine the evidence. Well, what evidence do we have? We find it listed for us very briefly in Luke chapter 24, as well as the other Gospels. Look what it says. Now on the first day of the week, very early in the morning, they came unto the sepulchre. Now these are the women who had seen where Jesus was laid. Now, Luke has compiled, Luke wasn't there. Luke is a writer who is a doctor. He's been convinced by these accounts that he's been around Christians who've been saying these things, that he's become so convinced of it that now he's compiling all the accounts to prove that this is definitely true. He says at the beginning of the book, in Luke chapter 1, I've thoroughly researched these things. I've looked into all of these accounts, and I'm convinced that this is true. And so Luke provides accounts, and he gives the names of the people. Why is that? Well, Luke is writing probably somewhere 10 or 20 years after Jesus rose from the dead, somewhere in that range. And so he's writing the names of women who are still around that you can still ask, and they'll still tell the same story, meaning they didn't change their minds. That's why he's writing their names. You see it in verse 10. It was Mary Magdalene and Joanna and Mary the mother of James and the other women. He doesn't mention the other women, probably because they weren't people that anyone knew, so it wasn't helpful to give you their names. He's giving the names of the ones that you can go ask, which means Luke is confident not only that these people made these claims, but they still are making the claims today. If you go ask them, they haven't recanted, they haven't changed their mind. Even though they're being hated and persecuted and chased out of town for it, if you find them, they're going to tell you the same story. They haven't changed their mind, which means they believe it. They believed it. Peter, we know for a fact, historical fact, we know that Peter was martyred for his claim that Jesus rose from the dead. We know that. It's written by the enemies of Christianity. They all acknowledge Peter died for his claim that Jesus rose from the dead. That means that Peter believed it. Right? You don't die for something you think is a lie. You might die for something that is a lie, but you don't die thinking that it's a lie. You die thinking that it's true. You know, the terrorists who bombed the towers in 9/11, they flew planes in the tower. Look, they died, but they believed what they were dying for. They were wrong. They died for a lie, but they believed it. Peter died for this, meaning he believed it. Well, what is it that he believed? Look at what it says in verse 2. They found the stone rolled away from the sepulchre. Now, it's important to remember that there were guards that were placed in front of the tomb because the Jewish leaders were convinced that Jesus had predicted his own death and resurrection, which also goes to provide evidence that if Jesus did rise from the dead, that makes him something special, doesn't it? I mean, he not only rose from the dead, but he predicted it before it happened. He prophesied that he was going to die and rise from the dead. So the Jewish leaders knew that Jesus was going to die, or claimed that he was going to raise from the dead after he died. So they posted a guard at the tomb to make sure that nobody got in there and stole the body and claimed that Jesus rose from the dead. Now, when the women get there, the stone that had been rolled over the tomb and sealed has been rolled away. And they're thinking, how can this be? Now, Mary Magdalene apparently thought that the soldiers had gone in, taken the body, and moved it to another location so that the Christians could not come and honor his body. And so she runs to go tell Peter and John, they've stolen his body, they've stolen his body. In the meantime, the Pharisees are saying, they must have stolen his body. You know what this means? The fact that both groups thought the body was stolen means the tomb was actually empty. Nobody knows where the body is. Well, that gives you a really good evidence that supports the idea of a resurrection, because the body is completely missing. Nobody stole it because everyone's saying everyone else stole it. And that means the body was gone and nobody could have stolen it. The people who, the Pharisees had no reason to steal it. They wanted to show the body to say that Jesus wasn't risen. They didn't steal the body. And the disciples died believing that Jesus rose from the dead. That's not the attitude of somebody who stole a body and knows it's a lie. So then what do you have? How you can explain that there's no body anymore? The body's gone. There was a guard at the tomb. The enemies of Christians can't produce his body. They don't know where it is. And the Christians themselves are convinced that Jesus rose from the dead so much that they die for that belief, meaning they didn't steal the body. They didn't knowingly preach a lie. They were convinced that it was true. So explain for me where the body is if Jesus didn't rise from the dead. He rose from the dead. It's the only thing that explains it. That's not the only piece of evidence. But Jesus really lived. He really went around doing miracles. He really was crucified, and his body's gone. And here's another evidence that his body's gone. Luke is trying to avoid giving us the names of the people who first found the tomb empty. Here's the reason why. Luke is writing his gospel to a man named Theophilus, who was a very intelligent, high up guy in the Greek world, in the Roman world, but they spoke Greek. He had a Greek name, Theophilus. He calls him Most Excellent Theophilus. He had some high position. Now, here's the thing about that time. When in a court of law in those days, especially in Israel, you were not allowed to submit testimony from a woman. Now, you say, well, that's terrible. Yeah, it is terrible. I'm not saying the Bible didn't tell them to do that. That was just the society of the time. They thought women were, they're too emotional and they're too this and that, and they could get things wrong. So we don't accept testimony from women in society. Which means that if you were going to make up a lie about Jesus rising from the dead, you would not say that 3 women found the tomb empty. It's not admissible testimony. Which means Luke was not lying about this. He says, look, guys, I have to tell you the truth. I don't want to say this, but it was a bunch of women who found the tomb empty. Why? Well, in his time, it made his story not credible. Because there were actually enemies of Christians in the first couple centuries that wrote about how there's no way Jesus rose from the dead because your evidence is women. You'll just have a bunch of women who said that he was. You can't even admit that testimony. Today, we look back and say there's no way anybody would lie saying that it was women, which means it certainly was true. These women certainly did find the tomb empty. This is wonderful because historians examine this passage of Scripture, and even ones who don't want to admit that Jesus rose from the dead have to admit the tomb must have been empty. It must have been empty, and we can't explain where the body went. Nobody can. Well, the Christians can, because we understand that he rose from the dead. Let's continue on. Verse 4, it came to pass as they were much perplexed. These women did not go there and say, the body's gone. He rose from the dead. They said, well, where'd they take his body? They must have taken it somewhere. They didn't just say, Jesus rose from the dead. They weren't inclined to think Jesus was going to rise from the dead. They even write about how they didn't even understand that he was going to rise from the dead yet. And that's embarrassing. If I was lying about myself finding Jesus' tomb, I would say I went to the tomb because I believed that Jesus was going to rise from the dead. And when I got there, it was empty, just as I thought. Right? That's how you lie about yourself. You don't lie in embarrassing ways. You lie in ways that make yourself look good. Well, this makes them look pretty bad. They get there, they get to the tomb, and they're looking around for him. Where's his body? They don't even believe that he's rising from the dead. It says this, it came to pass they were much perplexed thereabout. Behold, 2 men stood by them in shining garments, and they were afraid, and bowed down their faces to the earth, and said unto them, why seek ye the living among the dead? Notice the angels are rebuking them in a soft way, not in a harsh way, but they're bringing a rebuke against them. That's not how you make up lies about yourself, by the way. You don't make up lies. I saw an angel and he told me I was doing wrong. No, not if you're lying. Why seek ye the living among the dead? They said, you guys are looking for the living one, the one who is alive forevermore and provides life for all who seek him. That's the one you're seeking in a grave? You guys realize what you're doing right now, right? He's not here, but is risen. Remember how he spake to you when he was yet in Galilee. Were you guys not even listening when he told you he was going to die and rise from the dead? And they're thinking, I thought that was a parable. I didn't think that was real, Saying, the Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men and be crucified, and the 3rd day rise again. And they remembered his words. They say, oh, yeah, I remember that. He meant that literally. And verse 10. It was Mary Magdalene and Joanna and Mary the mother of James and the other women that were with them, and which told these things unto the apostles. And their words seemed to them as idle tales, and they believed them not. The apostles didn't believe. Remember that when Luke writes this down, he's writing it down 15, maybe 20 years after the event. At the time that Luke is writing this down, the apostles, these 11, 10 of them, one of them has already been martyred, they're out going around Israel and around the world even, preaching that Jesus rose from the dead. And here is Luke, while these men are preaching that Jesus rose from the dead, writing, when they first heard that Jesus rose from the dead, they said, that's nonsense. There's no way that happened. I don't believe that for a second. That's embarrassing. That's an embarrassing thing to write about the people who are preaching that Jesus rose from the dead. They didn't believe it. But it's true. You don't make up lies that are embarrassing, but you do tell truths that sometimes embarrass people. And that's what Luke is doing. He's telling what really happened. It's embarrassing, but that's what happened. Their words seemed unto them as idle tales. They believed them not. Now here's the thing. They were probably trying to rationalize all this. But if you read the book of John, and we won't do that for sake of time today, but if you read the book of John, when Peter and John ran to the tomb, they left, it says, believing. And the reason is that when they got to the tomb and they looked and they saw it empty, they saw the grave clothes lying there in the tomb. Now, this was important because they were thinking someone took the body and moved it so we can't come and honor Jesus. But Peter starts to scratch his head. He says, but why would they leave the grave clothes and take the decaying body and unwrap it? Why would they do that? Why would they? Why? And then one of the napkin that covered his face was folded. He's thinking, maybe in a hurry they grabbed the body and they're dragging it out and the grave clothes fall off, but why would they turn back and fold it? This doesn't make any sense. Something's going on here, and it's not that they stole the body. So what happened? And he leaves believing, meaning his heart is ready to believe. He's believing that something more happened. Doesn't know yet what happened exactly, but he leaves prepared in his heart that this must be true. Now, we're going to read down just a little further in Luke and close. I like to throw the word close in when we get pretty close. But verse 13. Verse 13. And behold, two of them went that same day to a village called Emmaus, which was from Jerusalem about 80 furlongs, and they talked together of all these things that had happened. And it came to pass that while they communed together and reasoned, Jesus himself drew near and went with them. But their eyes were holden that they should not know him. And he said unto them, what manner of communications are these, that ye have one to another as ye walk and are sad? And one of them, whose name was Cleophas, answering, said unto them, art thou only a stranger in Jerusalem, and hast not known the things which are come to pass there in these days? Again, these are embarrassing things. They're talking to Jesus, don't even realize it, because they're so confident that he's not going to show up. Even though these women have said, hey, look, we saw the tomb empty, Jesus, the angel said he's alive, they are so convinced that the ladies must be crazy. They must be just filled with wishful thinking that they're seeing things. And now Jesus shows up, and they don't recognize him. Now, they are supernaturally withheld from recognizing him, but I think also it's embarrassing to them, and yet this part of the story wasn't left out by Luke. Luke goes ahead and tells the truth. Here's what happened, guys. Verse 20, and they talk about how, verse 19, and he said unto them, what things? And they said unto him, concerning Jesus of Nazareth, which was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how the chief priests and our rulers delivered him to be condemned to death, and have crucified him. But we trusted that it had been he which should have redeemed Israel. Say, we were wrong. We thought he was the Christ who was going to come and redeem Israel, but now he's dead. So I guess we were wrong. I can't believe. How could we be wrong? He did everything right. He was working miracles. I don't know, how could we possibly be wrong? But we're wrong. He's dead. They were convinced that Jesus had not risen from the dead, even after the ladies came and told them the tomb is empty, the grave clothes are there, there's no explanation. They were still not convinced. Okay, so Jesus says to them, In verse 25, we'll skip down just for sake of time. Then he said unto them, O fools, and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Ought not Christ to have suffered these things and to enter into his glory? Didn't you know from the Old Testament that the Messiah was going to have to die? You didn't know that? Guys, go back and read the Old Testament. It said, verse 27, beginning at Moses and all the prophets, he expounded unto them in all scriptures the things concerning himself. And they drew nigh unto the village whither they went, and he made as though he would have gone further, but they constrained him, saying, Abide with us, for it is toward evening, and the day is far spent. And he went in to tarry with them. And it came to pass, as he sat at meat with them, he took bread, and blessed it, and brake it, and gave it to them. Maybe on the road, it was getting dark. Maybe that's why they couldn't see him. Their eyes were held from being able to see him. But in verse 31, now in the house, with maybe some lamps lit or whatever, it says their eyes were opened, and they knew him. And he vanished out of their sight. And they said one to another, Did not our hearts burn within us while he talked with us by the way, and while he opened to us the Scriptures? And they rose the same hour and returned to Jerusalem, and found the 11 gathered together, and them that were with them, saying, The Lord is risen indeed, and hath appeared unto Simon. Guess what? They didn't believe the ladies. They waited until the Lord appeared to Simon, which is Peter, Simon Peter. Jesus showed himself to Simon. Now we believe that he was risen. If these two came back and said, get this, he's been all over the place today. We just saw him in Emmaus. And then we ran back and he was already here and had already spoken to Peter. Now, the question is this just seeing things? Well, it can't be seeing things because multiple people are seeing him at the same time. We don't have the same illusion at the same time. It's either really there or it's not there. And if I'm seeing things, you're not going to see the same thing, right? That's how you know if you say, are you seeing what I'm seeing? Right? That's how you know if you're seeing something that's real. So multiple people now are seeing Jesus at the same time. Remember, these are people who are going to die. They are going to die for this, meaning they're not lying. They are willing to die believing this is actually true. So they believe it's true. So now we have to say somehow they were fooled. Somehow these people who believe this is true must have been fooled. How could they have been fooled? Well, they weren't hallucinating because more than one person saw the same thing at the same time. So then what could it be? Well, maybe they're seeing a ghost. Maybe that's what they're seeing. He's disappearing. Maybe that's what they're seeing. Well, let's read a little further. Verse 30, he appeared unto Simon, verse 34, so we're on verse 35. And they told what things were done in the way, how he was known of them in breaking of bread. And as they thus spake, Jesus himself stood in the midst of them. As they're talking about the sightings of Jesus that they've had, all of a sudden Jesus is standing there in their midst. In the midst of them. And he said unto them, Peace be unto you. And they were terrified and affrighted and supposed they had seen a spirit. If you think, well, maybe they just saw a ghost, that's what they thought, guys. That's what they thought. They thought, we must be seeing a ghost. Now, if you're going around telling people that Jesus rose from the dead, and Luke is writing that you thought it was a ghost when Jesus first rose from the dead, that seems embarrassing, right? He wasn't really risen. He must have been a ghost. Even after they were just said, Jesus is risen indeed. Then there's Jesus. Oh, it's a ghost. This is not the way you tell a lie, guys. It's certainly not the way that you tell a story about a hallucination. These are things that really happened. So here's Jesus. They immediately think we're seeing Jesus' ghost. Verse 38. And he said unto them, Why are you troubled, and why do thoughts arise in your hearts? Behold, my hands and my feet. It is I myself. Handle me, and see, for a spirit hath not flesh and bones, as ye see me have. He says, guys, I want you to know that I rose for real. Just because I have the power to appear inside of a building doesn't mean that I'm a ghost. So touch my hands, touch my feet, see the wounds that are still there. Now, Jesus is really, truly alive. His body rose from the grave. That's where his body went. It's alive. It's not dead. It's still alive. Verse 41, he says, And while they yet believed not, but this time for joy. They're thinking, wow, this is just too good. I'm going to wake up any minute and realize this is just a dream. There's no way what I'm looking at is true. I'm touching him. This has to be a dream. They believed not for joy and wondered. Again, not something you write as a lie about yourself. He said unto them, Have ye here any meat? And they gave him a piece of a broiled fish and a honeycomb, and he took it and did eat before them. And then he goes on to give them the Great Commission and other things. He eats food in front of them. What we're finding then is not only that we have historical, documented, eyewitness, trustworthy testimony that Jesus, in fact, did rise from the dead in reality, not just in our imaginations and what we want to believe. Jesus rose from the dead, but also that Jesus wanted to make sure that we had the evidence for these things. He shows up, he's like, I want you to make sure that you understand I am really alive. Touch me. I'm going to eat some food in front of you. Then the food's going to be gone. Ghosts don't eat food, right? That doesn't work. It's not going to fall on the ground like Casper, right? All right? I am alive, and you need to know this. This is the reason why the disciples went to their death, because Jesus rose from the dead. It wasn't a lie. You can't explain any of these facts. You can't explain them with any other solution other than Jesus rose from the dead. And I submit to you that if Jesus rose from the dead, since Jesus rose from the dead in reality, not just in some concept, Jesus really rose from the dead. And since Jesus rose from the dead, we must do what the apostles did. Give our lives, declaring the fact that Jesus is alive. He rose from the dead. And even if you kill me, it doesn't matter, because I have a resurrection coming. I know that because Jesus rose from the dead. And by the way, if you want to be a part of that, I've got to tell you, Jesus rose from the dead, and He is the only way for salvation. Why? How do I know that? Because He rose from the dead. That's how I know it. And He said so. He said so. If Jesus rose from the dead, then what He said matters. This matters. Jesus rose from the dead. He really did. He rose from the dead. We're not celebrating a fantasy. We're celebrating a true historical happening. And this is why we live and breathe. He sustains us every moment of every day so that we can live for Him as the apostles did. That we can die for Him if necessary. But never should we act as if believing that Jesus didn't rise from the dead is somehow some intellectual, intelligent thing to do. Because it is the most foolish thing anyone can do. The only way you can believe that Jesus didn't rise from the dead is because you either don't look at the evidence or you just don't want to come to the conclusion the evidence brings you to. Jesus rose from the dead. It's not a foolish story. It is the reason we live and breathe. Father in heaven, if you love us so much to send Jesus to die on the cross, and then you require that we believe in Christ to be saved, to find salvation, but you provide for us the evidence that we need to believe, then who are we to continue in unbelief? Lord, I want to say, as the man did who came to you in your ministry and said, Lord, I believe, but help my unbelief. I want to ask you, Lord, that you would help us all to grow in our faith. Not because we will it to be stronger, our faith, or that we've just decided, I'm going to believe God more, but rather that we would allow the eyewitness testimony, the evidence that you provided to help us to strengthen and grow our faith, and then to go and live according to your word. Father, I pray that you would let this Easter celebration, this celebration of the resurrection of Christ on this day, be a time of refreshing, that our lives would be brought back into line, that we would repent where we need to repent, and we'd realign ourselves with the truth of your word, with the teachings of Jesus and of the Scriptures, that we may be people that are well-pleasing to you because we realize this is a true thing. And we thank you for it. Pray these things in Jesus' name.